Sri Lanka's contribution to the development of the Pali Canon. Professor Oliver Abeynayake. Professor Oliver Abeynayake obtained his BA degree with first-class honors from the Vinaya University of Sri Lanka and his PhD degree from the University of Lancaster, England. He was formerly the head of the Department of Pali and Buddhist Studies at the University of Kelaniya, Sri Lanka. Presently, he is the Director of Research at the Buddhist and Pali University of Sri Lanka. This research article had been published in Buddhism for the New Millennium, London, World Buddhist Foundation, 2000, pages 163-183. Copyright 2000 World Buddhist Foundation, ISBN 0-9518957-1-0. It is reported in the Pali commentaries that the Pali Tipitaka, which was rehearsed in the first council, as well as in the subsequent councils, was brought to Sri Lanka by the Arahant Mahinda. The Vinaya, Sutta, and Abhidhamma are the three Pitakas. The Vinaya Pitaka consists of the Parajika Pali, Pasadiyapali, Mahavagapali, Kulavagapali, and Paravarapali. The Sutta Pitaka contains the following 5 Nikayas: Daya, Majjhima, Samyutta, Anguttara, and Kadaka, while the Kadaka Nikaya includes the following texts as its contents: Kadakatha, Dhammapada, Yadana, Itavataka, Sutta Nipata, Vimanavathu, Petavathu, Dharagatha, Tharigatha, Jataka, Nidesa, Padasambhadamaga, Apadana, Buddhavamsa, and Karyapataka. The Abhidhamma comprises 7 texts such as Dhammasangani, Vibhanga, Tatukatha, Pugalapanati, Kathavathu, Yamaka, and Patthana. It is believed that these 31 texts, which are considered the Tripitaka, exist even today, as they were brought to Sri Lanka by the Arahant Mahinda in the 3rd century BC. However, the reality goes against this general belief. The Pali Tripitaka seems to have undergone various changes in Sri Lanka due to interpolations and additions. The aim of this paper is to pay attention to such changes which occurred in Sri Lanka. According to the Sri Lankan tradition, the Vibhanga section of the Vinaya Pitaka consists of the Parajika Pali and the Pasadiyapali. However, 2 Vibhangas are not reckoned anywhere as the Parajika Pali and the Pasadiyapali in the Pali commentarial literature. When the Samana-Pasataka, Samangala-Vilasini, and the Athasalini are examined, it can be observed that the terms Mahavibhanga, Bhikkhuna-Vibhanga, Bhikkhu, Bhikkhuna-Vibhanga, or Dvivibhanga are used for the purpose of indicating the Vibhanga section of the Vinaya Pitaka. The structural change that took place in Sri Lanka with regard to the Vinaya Pitaka on accepting the Parajika Pali and the Pasadiyapali as the Vibhangas is not as minor as it seems. What the Arahant Mahinda brought to Sri Lanka is the Maha/Bhikkhu-Vibhanga and Bhikkhuna-Vibhanga. Their nature is explicitly given in the Nidana Katha of the Samangala-Vilasini. The Maha/Bhikkhu-Vibhanga was compiled by collecting together the precepts in their entirety with 7 Adikaranasamhitas enacted for the monks. Subsequently, the Bhikkhuna-Vibhanga was rehearsed as a collection of all precepts with the Adikaranasamhitas prescribed for the nuns. The accounts of the first council found in the Samana-Pasataka, Samangala-Vilasini, and the Athasalini make it very clear that 2 separate texts by the names of Bhikkhu-Vibhanga and Bhikkhuna-Vibhanga were prepared in the first council. These 2 texts were rehearsed in the subsequent councils too. Contrary to the truth, these 2 texts are considered identical with the Parajika Pali and the Pasadiyapali. The following observation shows that this popular belief is quite far from the truth. The Parajika Pali as it exists today contains the Bhikkha precepts belonging to the categories of Parajika, Aniyata, Sanghadasisa, and Nisagyapasidya and their expositions. The Pasadiyapali comprises not only the remaining Bhikkha precepts belonging to the categories of Pasatya, Padasaniya, Sakya, and Adikaranasamhita and their expositions, but also the Bhikkhuni precepts in toto and their expositions too. The Parajika Pali and the Pasadiyapali, which are substantially different from the Bhikkhu-Vibhanga and Bhikkhuna-Vibhanga, compiled in the first council as 2 collections of precepts pertaining to monks and nuns respectively, came into existence in Sri Lanka. The causes that led to this change and the exact period when it took place cannot be ascertained. However, some problems that had arisen due to this should be mentioned here. The decision arrived at in the First Council to name the text that contained the Bhikkhu precepts as the Bhikkhu Vibhanga, and the text that contained the Bhikkhuni precepts as the Bhikkhuna Vibhanga is quite justifiable. However, the designations of Parajikapali and Pasadiyapali, which came into existence in Sri Lanka in place of Bhikkhu Vibhanga and Bhikkhuna Vibhanga, do not seem to be either suitable or meaningful. The Parajikapali and the Pasadiyapali would have been named thus since the Parajikas are treated first in the Parajikapali and the Pasatiyas are treated first in the Pasadiyapali. It should, however, be mentioned here that the Parajikas promulgated for Bhikkhunis are found in the Pasadiyapali and certain Pasatiyas promulgated for Bhikkhus are found in the Parajikapali. This shows that a categorical division of precepts arranged according to a set pattern is not found in the Parajikapali and Pasadiyapali. It is quite obvious that the precepts for Bhikkhunis are absolutely ignored in proposing the designations of Parajikapali and Pasadiyapali. On the other hand, the balance maintained in the Bhikkhu Vibhanga and Bhikkhuna Vibhanga is pathetically lost in the Parajikapali and the Pasadiyapali. Only the meager number of 49 precepts are treated in the Parajikapali, while the rest, 489 in number, are treated in the Pasadiyapali. Another salient point pertaining to the Pasadiyapali is that it does not treat the Bhikkhuni precepts with same enthusiasm shown towards the Bhikkhu precepts. The redactors of the Pasadiyapali have sometimes ignored certain Bhikkhuni precepts by not providing relevant details. In addition, various portions of the Bhikkhuna Vibhanga are deliberately omitted in the process of inserting the contents of it into the Pasadiyapali. The conclusion that can be arrived at accordingly is that Bhikkhu Vibhanga in its entirety and the Bhikkhuna Vibhanga partially have remained in the Parajikapali and Pasadiyapali. The Sarvastivadi, Dharmagupta, Mahasaska, and Mahasanka schools of Indian Buddhism have designated their Vibhanga sections of the Vinaya Pitaka by the names of Bhiksu Vibhanga and Bhiksuna Vibhanga. The Mula Sarvastivada and Kasyapaya schools have utilized the terms Bhiksaprata Moksa and Bhiksunaprata Moksa instead. This shows that the terms Parajikapali and Pasadiyapali were first introduced by the Sri Lankans, even though they were commonly used later in the Theravāda tradition. The maltreatment of Bhikkhu Vibhanga in the Pasadiyapali shows that the terms Parajikapali and Pasadiyapali gained sway in an era in which the Bhikkhuni order was disappearing. If the Parajikapali and the Pasadiyapali are accepted as a Vibhanga section of the Pali Vinaya Pitaka, the inevitable conclusion that should be arrived at is that the Pali Vinaya Pitaka is not a collection of all Bhikkhuni precepts. The reason for this conclusion is the non-inclusion of the Bhikkhuna Vibhanga in its entirety into the Pasadiyapali. Only 128 Bhikkhuni precepts are treated in the Pasadiyapali with their relevant details, such as Vathu and Nidana out of 311 rules counted with the Adhikarana Samhitas. If the Sri Lankan tradition that the Vibhanga section of the Vinaya Pitaka is nothing but the Parajikapali and the Pasadiyapali is accepted, 183 Bhikkhuni precepts lose their canonical authority. The commentators rightly understood this problem. To solve it meaningfully, they came forward with a new definition of the Vinaya Pitaka, which states that the Vinaya Pitaka comprises not only two Vibhangas, but also the two Pratamaksas. The attempt to introduce two Pratamaksas in addition to two Vibhangas can be seen in this definition. Such an attempt was quite necessary to confer the canonical authority on the Bhikkhuni precepts that were excluded by accepting the Parajikapali and the Pasadiyapali in place of the Bhikkhu Vibhanga and the Bhikkhuna Vibhanga. The compilation of the Kankavitarani, in addition to the Samanasatika written on the entire Vinaya Pitaka, was also an attempt to establish the authority and authenticity of the two Pratamaksas, without which the Pali Vinaya Pitaka is not complete. Accordingly, a situation which compelled the compulsory inclusion of the two Pratamaksas into the Vinaya Pitaka arose in Sri Lanka. Such a necessity was not there when the Bhikkhu Vibhanga and the Bhikkhuna Vibhanga were included in the Vinaya Pitaka. The acceptance of the Parajikapali and the Pasadiyapali instead of the Bhikkhu Vibhanga and the Bhikkhuna Vibhanga gave rise to the Sri Lankan tendency that the Vinaya Pitaka comprises 7 texts. This goes against the generally accepted number of the texts of the Vinaya Pitaka as decided by the Indian schools of Buddhism. The Theravāda is another text of the Vinaya Pitaka which underwent a drastic change in Sri Lanka. There is no doubt that the Vinaya Pitaka, which was brought to Sri Lanka by the Arahant Mahinda, had a Theravāda, an addendum, in it. Various studies have already been done on the Vinaya Pitaka, belonging to several Indian schools of Buddhism. These studies have shown that almost all Indian schools of Buddhism, except Mahasanghikas and Mahasikas, had a Theravāda in their canonical Vinaya. The Sarvastivadins had several Theravādas in their Vinaya Pitaka, while the Dharmaguptalas had two. The Daipa Vamsa reports that the Mahasanghikas rejected the traditional Theravāda and substituted it with another. It shows that the Theravāda was known at the time of the emergence of the Mahasangha school. The Abhidhamma has recognized the subsections of the Vinaya Pitaka by the names of Vinaya, Khandaka, Taikaketa, and Pankama. The term Pankama in this context indicates nothing but the Theravāda according to the Abhidhamma. Even though the Abhidhamma developed through centuries, the canonical dignity was conferred on it before Buddhism was introduced to Sri Lanka. All these point to the fact that there was a text called Theravāda in the Tripitaka, which was brought to Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BC. The Sumangala Vilasini informs us that the Theravāda, in the size of 25 Banavaras, was rehearsed in the first council. However, there is evidence to prove that present Theravāda and the Theravāda, which was brought to Sri Lanka by the Arahant Mahinda, are not identical. A definite criterion to identify the original Theravāda is suggested in the definition of the Vinaya Pitaka found in the Samanapasadika. Accordingly, the original Theravāda is reckoned as So Asaparivara. The So Asaparivara does not embrace the entire Theravāda now existing, but is confined to a segment of it. There are two 16-fold Theravādas, as So Asaparivara in the Bhikkhu-Vibhanga and So Asaparivara in the Bhikkhu-Vibhanga in the present Theravāda. The redactors of the councils were careful enough to insert the statements Mahavibhan So Asaparivara Nithaita, Bhikkhu-Vibhanj, So Asaparivara Nithaita at the end of the first and the second Vibhangas in the Theravāda. It is legitimate, therefore, to think that the original Theravāda comprised only the first 2 chapters of the present Theravāda. The remaining portions of the present Theravāda can be considered as being interpolated into it at a later stage. The nature of the first 2 chapters of the Theravāda is quite different from that of the rest. Since the first 2 chapters discuss the matters pertaining to the Vibhangas of the Vinaya Pitaka, it is legitimate to think that the remaining chapters are on the problems arising from the Kanvakas. However, the remaining chapters have gone beyond the subject matter of the Kanvakas. What can be found in a careful scrutiny is that the present Theravāda is an amalgamation of 2 distinctive parts. The first part, which is the original Theravāda, comprises only the first 2 chapters of the text and the second part the rest. The 2 salient characteristics of the second part are the abundance of small chapters and the stanzas. The second part is not a precise and methodical essay, as the first part is. It is therefore obvious that the first 2 chapters of the present Theravāda and the rest were composed at 2 different times. The Indian origin of the first part, which covers only the first 2 chapters, is quite obvious. It is what was brought to Sri Lanka by the Arahant Mahinda. The second part, which covers the remaining chapters, seems to have been added in Sri Lanka as an appendix to the original Theravāda. The supplementary evidence that can be adduced to prove the fact that the Theravāda underwent a tremendous change in Sri Lanka should be briefly mentioned here. At the end of the text, it is observed that the Theravāda was caused to be compiled by a bhikkhu named Daipa for the benefit of the learners. The colophon further states that the methodology of the ancient teachers was inserted freely and the text was abridged in doing so. It is therefore legitimate to think that the role played by the Venerable Daipa was not confined to wanting down of the Theravāda, which was orally transmitted till then. The opportunity that the Venerable Daipa had to abridge the text would have been enjoyed by another to expand the text. The Theravāda mentions the names of the participants of the third council held in the reign of King Dharmasoka. The Theravāda reveals a succession of teachers who orally handed down the Vinaya Pitaka. It is important to note here that some of those teachers flourished during the reign of King Vadagamaniabaya. The Theravāda informs us a Sri Lankan bhikkhu named Papa, who re-established the Buddhist ascent in India after Buddhism disappeared from its soil. Vamsathapakasini, the sub-commentary on the Mahavamsa, records that the controversies with regard to the Theravāda paved the way for schism in Sri Lankan Buddhism. The The Theravāda is the only canonical work where Sri Lanka is mentioned by the name of Tambapani. According to the available evidence, Sri Lanka was not known among those who formulated the Pali Canon. On the other hand, the Theravāda is the only canonical work where the Arahant Mahinda's arrival in Sri Lanka is mentioned. The Theravāda specifically states that the Arahant Mahinda came here from India. The word here in the relevant statement indicates Sri Lanka, without any doubt. Such an information can be available only in a text which underwent a marked change in Sri Lanka. On the data scattered throughout, the Theravāda can be identified as a text where the stanzas, sermons, and dialogues composed, preached, and compiled by the Sri Lankan monks are heavily collected. As mentioned before, the Venerable Daipa was instrumental in preserving the Theravāda for the benefit of learners. As the statement Likapisi Sisakanam Sakavaham points out, the Theravāda was meant to be a textbook to be studied by those who had an interest in the matters concerning discipline. It is therefore justifiable to conclude that the present Theravāda is a revision and expansion of the original Theravāda, which was brought to Sri Lanka by the Arahant Mahinda. In this revision and expansion where the interests of the learners were looked into, the Theravāda was transformed into a textbook prepared on the curriculum of the Mahavihara at Anuradhapura. The first four Nikayas of the Tripitaka in the Pali Canon too underwent certain changes in Sri Lanka. The first glimpse of this kind can be seen in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta of the Nikaya. It is well known that the Mahaparinibbana Sutta grew for centuries, collecting material from various sources. Its Indian development culminated with the interpolations added in the third council held in the reign of King Dharmasoka. Sumangala Vilasini, the commentary on the Nikaya, explicitly states that the sections on the distribution of relics and erection of 10 stupas were added to the Sutta in the third council. The Nikaya, with the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, thus developed in India, was brought to Sri Lanka by the Arahant Mahinda. When the Sumangala Vilasini is carefully examined, it is evident that the Mahaparinibbana Sutta further developed in Sri Lanka. The Mahaparinibbana Sutta, with 6 Banavaras, is supposed to be the longest discourse found in the entire Pali Canon. The 6th Banavara of the Sutta comprises the last statement of the Buddha, Buddha's great demise, arrival of the Arahant Kasyapa, distribution of relics, and the worship of the relic stupas. The discourse ends with 5 stanzas appended to the 6th Banavara. With regard to these stanzas, the Sumangala Vilasini points out that they were added to the discourse by the Sri Lankan monks. It should be remembered here that the stanzas identical with these 5 are found in the Buddha Vamsa of the Kādaka Nikaya too. It is therefore reasonable to think that the Buddha Vamsa was also enriched with these stanzas by the Sri Lankan monks. This is an explicit example of Sri Lankan interpretations in the Pali Canon. What is important here is that the commentators themselves attribute the authorship of these stanzas to the Sri Lankan monks. It further implies that, though they are not definitely identified, there may be more Sri Lankan interpolations of this nature in the Pali Canon. It should be emphasized here that the 5 stanzas added to the Mahaparinibbana Sutta by the Sri Lankan monks laid the foundation for various tendencies which emerged later in the Sri Lankan culture. The stories of relics found in the Pali commentaries, Sinhala classics on Buddhism, and legends were influenced by these stanzas. There is no evidence to prove the worship of tooth relics was known in India before Buddhism was brought to Sri Lanka. The present-day dominance of the worship of tooth relic seems to have been a Sri Lankan innovation. The 5 stanzas added to the Mahaparinibbana Sutta and the Buddha Vamsa seem to have inspired the Sri Lankan writers who filled the gaps of the history of the tooth relic, which was brought here in the reign of King Kittisari Mega. The fact that there are 4 stanzas authored by the Sri Lankan monks in the Sammaditthi Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya is extremely important to the subject matter of this paper. The undivided honor of this discovery should go to the Venerable Yakadu Sri Pragnarama, the late principal of the Vidyalankara Piravina in Sri Lanka. As observed by the Venerable Pragnarama, the 4 stanzas were added to highlight topics discussed in the discourse. Since 3 of the 4 stanzas are cryptic, some editors of the Majjhima Nikaya were anxious enough to expunge them from the Sammaditthi Sutta. These 4 stanzas seem to be ambiguous and meaningless only if they are considered as Pali compositions. As pointed out by the Venerable Pragnarama, They are composed in Sinhala Prakrit. He was led to this remarkable discovery by the word Vadanake, found in each of the 4 stanzas. The Venerable Pragnarama has made it clear that these 4 stanzas can be easily comprehended with help of Ashokan Prakrit, language employed in the early Sinhala inscriptions, and the quotations taken to the Dampiya Atua Gadapadaya from Sinhala commentaries. As observed further by the Venerable Pragnarama, it cannot be concluded that the additions were not made to the Pali Tripitaka in Sri Lanka. It is well known that there are additions done in Sri Lanka in the Pali commentaries, since they are full of events and information of Sri Lankan origin. In the same way, the canonical works have evidence to prove that the Sri Lankan monks prepared the list of contents to the discourses of extreme importance and inserted them at the proper places. The purpose of this endeavor was not only refreshing their memories, but also helping the learners. The Venerable Pragnarama has adduced the 4 stanzas found in the Samadhithi Sutta to substantiate this assumption. As pointed out by the Venerable Pragnarama further, there are 8 Sinhala sentences in the Mullapariya Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya. The services rendered by the Venerable Pragnarama to the Sinhala language by editing and interpreting these sentences, which were deleted and wrongly quoted by some editors of the Majjhima Nikaya, should be greatly appreciated. According to the Venerable Pragnarama, one finds it easy to understand how the Arahant Mahinda preached the Dhamma and communicated with the Sinhala people as soon as he arrived in Sri Lanka, when one examines these Sinhala sentences. It is also easy to solve the problems pertaining to the nature of early Sri Lankan language and its affinities to the other languages. Venerable Pragnarama emphasizes the fact that the Aryan origin of Sinhala language can be proved beyond doubt on the basis of the 8 sentences enshrined in the Mullapariya Sutta. There is no direct evidence of Sri Lankan interpolations either in the Samyutta Nikaya or in the Anguttara Nikaya. However, our attention should be paid here to 2 commentarial remarks regarding their extent. According to these remarks, the Samyutta Nikaya comprises 7,762 discourses, while the Anguttara Nikaya is a collection of 9,957 discourses. The numbers of the discourses in the present Samyutta Nikaya and the Anguttara Nikaya differ from the above numbers. As pointed out by the Venerable Palwat Buddhadatta, the number of the discourses in the present Samyutta Nikaya, counted with repetitions, is 9,726. This exceeds the commentarial number by 1,964. The Venerable Buddhadatta is of the opinion that the number of the discourses of the present Samyutta Nikaya can be reduced to 6,146 if the repetitions are not counted separately. This shows a reduction of 1,610 discourses from the commentarial number. According to the Venerable Buddhadatta's computation, the present Anguttara Nikaya consists of 7,791 discourses. The reduction of the number of discourses in the present Anguttara Nikaya is then 1,766 when compared to the commentarial number. According to the PTS editions, the numbers of the discourses of these 2 Nikayas are lesser than the numbers given by the Venerable Buddhadatta. Compared with the commentarial numbers of the discourses, it is obvious that the present Samyutta and Anguttara Nikayas are quite abridged. As we know, the Venerable Buddhaghosa wrote 2 commentaries on the Samyutta and Anguttara Nikayas under the names of Sarat Hapakasini and Manarath Purani, respectively. When these 2 commentaries are examined, the obvious conclusion that can be arrived at is that the present Samyutta and Anguttara Nikayas are identical with those that the Venerable Buddhaghosa had before him. What can then be said about the Samyutta with 7,762 discourses and the Anguttara with 9,957 discourses? Did the Venerable Mahinda bring to Sri Lanka the extended versions or the abridged versions of the Samyutta and Anguttara? Or else, are the present Samyutta and Anguttara Nikayas the revised editions of the extended versions brought to Sri Lanka by the Arahant Mahinda? There is yet another point that should be considered here. The similarity that exists between the first 2 Nikayas and the corresponding Gamas weathers away among the remaining Nikayas and the Gamas. In other words, Samyutta and Anguttara Nikayas are quite different from the corresponding Gamas of Samyutta and Ekatara. This dissimilarity points to the fact that these Nikayas and Gamas underwent drastic changes in their own traditions. What was preserved and established in the Theravāda school of Buddhism in Sri Lanka was the Pali Canon, which was brought here by the Arahant Mahinda. It is therefore reasonable to ask the question whether the Samyutta and Angutta Nikayas were revised and edited in Sri Lanka to minimize the repetitions the originals had. It is a Khaddaka Nikaya that undergone a qualitative and a quantitative difference in Sri Lanka. The Khaddaka Nikaya developed in India for centuries before Buddhism was introduced to Sri Lanka. The developments that took place in Sri Lanka in the Khaddaka Nikaya should not therefore be considered unnatural and alien. Even though it is well known that the Khaddaka Nikaya is 15-fold, it is unknown that this is a Sri Lankan concept. There is no evidence to prove that none of the Indian schools of Buddhism which emerged before or after Buddhism was introduced to Sri Lanka accepted that the Khaddaka Nikaya is 15-fold. In fact, there was no definite decision of the number of the Ksudrakagama in any of the Indian schools of Buddhism. Even the Bhanaka traditions which emerged and developed in India and later came to Sri Lanka had not taken a decision in this regard. The idea that the Khaddaka Nikaya is 15-fold was first expressed in the commentaries attributed to the Venerable Buddhaghosa. It can safely be concluded that the Khaddaka Nikaya comprises 15 texts is a concept well established in the Mahavihara tradition. With the establishment of the concept that the Khaddaka Nikaya is 15-fold in the Mahavihara tradition, a new text not known to the Indian Buddhists was introduced to the Khaddaka Nikaya in Sri Lanka. That is the Khaddakapatha. What was expected by the statement that the Khaddaka Nikaya is 15-fold is to justify the inclusion of the Khaddakapatha in the Khaddaka Nikaya and to put an end to its future developments. Whether these expectations were fulfilled in the history should be separately examined. What is to be noted here is that the Mahavihara tradition of Sri Lanka seems to have had the opinion that the non-commitment of the Indian schools of Buddhism as to the definite number of the texts of the Khaddaka Nikaya had paved the way for the contamination of the Buddha's word. When the sources in which the list of the Khaddaka texts is found are examined, it is quite obvious that it is only the Venerable Buddhaghosa who translated the Sinhala commentaries, following the Mahavihara tradition that includes the Khaddakapatha in the Khaddaka Nikaya. The Khaddakapatha is not mentioned either in the list of the Daya Bhanakas or in the list of the Majjhima Bhanakas, as revealed in the Samangala Vilasini. The Indian Buddhists did not have any knowledge of a text called Khaddakapatha, according to the information available with regard to the Khaddaka texts accepted by the Indian schools of Buddhism. The Samanapasadika of Buddhaghosa was translated into Chinese within the first century of its compilation. This Chinese translation had taken all precautionary measures not to mention the name of the Khaddakapatha. This shows that only the Sri Lankan tradition had accepted the Khaddakapatha as a canonical text. The authority of the Khaddakapatha has been questioned even by the ancient Sri Lankan teachers. The Palamahabhadavamsa, written 5 centuries after Buddhaghosa, the Siddharma and the Sinhala translation of the Milinda, written 10 centuries after Buddhaghosa, have deliberately dropped the Khaddakapatha from the list of the Khaddaka texts. No other Khaddaka text has undergone this treatment. The request extended to the Venerable Buddhaghosa to write a commentary on the Khaddakapatha was yet another Sri Lankan attempt to insert the Khaddakapatha into the Khaddaka Nikaya. The selection of the Khaddakapatha by Buddhaghosa over various other authentic texts was justified by placing the Khaddakapatha as the first among the Khaddaka texts. The Tripitaka is the commentary written by Buddhaghosa on the Khaddakapatha. Buddhaghosa wrote a commentary on the Sutta Nipata II by the same name. According to the commentarial order of the Khaddaka texts, which runs as Khaddakapatha, Dhammappada, Udana, Itavataka, Sutta Nipata, etc., Buddhaghosa should have selected the Udana after the Khaddakapatha, since he has written the commentary on the Dhammappada. However, Buddhaghosa selected the Sutta Nipata, overstepping even the Itavataka, and wrote a commentary on it by the name of the Khaddakapatha commentary. The reason behind this attempt should be the conferment of the authority and authenticity of the Sutta Nipata on the Khaddakapatha. The introductory remarks of the Khaddakapatha imply this further. According to Buddhaghosa, the Khaddakapatha is absolutely complete. Buddhaghosa expresses how difficult it is for a person such as himself, not understanding the doctrine, to write a commentary on the Khaddakapatha. However, Buddhaghosa states that he summons up courage to attempt the task as the decisions of the ancient teachers exist up to his day. When the nature of the Khaddakapatha is considered, the above statements of Buddhaghosa would be meaningful only when they are taken as an attempt to confer canonical dignity on the Khaddakapatha. The contents of the Kadakapatha, with the only exception of the Nidikanda Sutta, are found elsewhere in the Pali Canon. Therefore, the Indian schools of Buddhism did not confront with the problem of conferring canonical authority on the Kadakapatha. The position assigned to the Kadakapatha in the Mahavihara curriculum would have prompted Buddhaghosa to insert it in the Kadaka Nikaya. The Nidikanda Sutta, whose canonical authority would have otherwise been lost, would have greatly contributed towards this attempt. Its suitability as a textbook meant for the novices, its conciseness and popularity as a prescribed text would have been conducive to the inclusion of the Kadakapatha in the Pali Canon in Sri Lanka. The Kokaliya Sutta of the Sutta Nipata is an ideal example of the Sri Lankan interpolations in the Pali Canon. The Kokaliya Sutta, which is an exposition of both prose and verse, is the 10th discourse of the Mahavagga of the Sutta Nipata. The prose passages which constitute the first part of the discourse comprises a dialogue between the Buddha and the monk Kokaliya, the destiny of Kokaliya, who did not pay heed to the Buddha's admonitions, the message of Sampati, the Brahma, conveyed to the Buddha, and the Buddha's account of hell is given in connection with Kokaliya's sorrowful birth. The actual discourse preached after these preliminary remarks is given in verse. Therefore, the stanzas of the sutta are more important than the prose passages. The present Kokaliya Sutta consists of 22 stanzas, however. The commentary on the Sutta Nipata observes clearly that this is a discourse of 20 stanzas. To justify his statement that the Kokaliya Sutta, which in fact is 22 stanzas, consists only of 20 stanzas, the author of the commentary, the Venerable Buddhaghosa in this case, observes that the last 2 stanzas are not available in the concluding expositions of the Mahathakatha. In other words, the Mahathakatha, which was brought to Sri Lanka and translated into Sinhala by the Arahant Mahinda, did not contain the comments on the last 2 stanzas of the present Kokaliya Sutta. The author of the Sutta Nipata commentary confirms the fact that these 2 stanzas had become the integral part of the Kokaliya Sutta by the 5th century AD. The meaning of all this is that the 2 stanzas were interpolated to the Kokaliya Sutta after the Arahant Mahindas and the Venerable Buddhaghosa's commentarial pursuits. The fact recorded here is significant because it points with more or less certainty to a specific instance of an addition, however small, made to the Pali Canon a considerable time after it was brought to Ceylon and probably after it was committed to writing at Matula Janapada. The Apadana of the Kadaka Nikaya too is evidence to prove that it was edited several times. The Apadana is a poetical composition divided mainly into 2 parts as Therapadana and Theripadana. The PTS edition of the text contained 547 stories of Thera's categories in 55 Vaggas. However, a statement found in the text itself indicates that there are 550 stories of Theras. Accordingly, the PTS editions has lost 3 stories. Even though there should be 10 stories in the 34th Vagga, in actual fact, there are only 7 stories. Non-inclusion of these stories in the PTS edition seems to be a result of an inadvertence. The Sinhala edition of the Apadana, prepared and published by the Venerable Palwat Buddhadatta, has 552 stories of Theras belonging to 50 Vaggas. This exceeds the number of stories given in the text itself by 2. The commentary on the Apadana has made this position more confused and perplexed. According to the introductory remarks of the Apadana, there are 510 stories of Theras divided into 51 Vaggas. However, the colophon of the commentary declares that there are 561 stories of Theras in the Apadana. The last 10 stories on which the comment are found in the Apadana are not available in any printed edition of the Apadana. The Buddhadatta edition and the commentarial expositions obviously manifest that the omission of the 3 stories in the PTS edition is an editor's error. It is, however, not clear why the stories, 10 in number, on which the expositions are found in the commentary, are missing in the printed editions. The following hypothesis can be suggested in this regard. Though the Apadana, which was brought to Sri Lanka by the Arahant Mahinda, consisted only of 550 stories of Theras, certain stories were added to it in Sri Lanka. The commentary was written not on the original version, but on the extended Sri Lankan version. It was, however, later decided to accept the original version uncontaminated with later interpolations. The differences that have arisen between the present Apadana and its commentary might be due to this reason. The lateness and non-authenticity of the Visadhajana Vilasini, the Abeynayake commentary, justify this assumption. The Abeynayake has 40 stories of theories, the number which is not controversial. A commentary was never written on these stories. It is therefore unreasonable to think on this ground that the stories of theories were added to the Abeynayake only after the Vilayasini was written. As the remarks given at the very outset introducing the numbers of theras and theories indicate, the author of the Abeynayake commentary was well aware of the 40 stories pertaining to the theories. However, there is no way of deciding whether the author of the commentary did not have the opportunity to write a commentary on the stories of theories, or whether he left it to another scholar. The stories of theories have not yet been commented upon. The changes that have taken place regard to the Buddhavamsa in Sri Lanka are so enormous that it is very difficult to restore the original Buddhavamsa. The details pertaining to this have been unearthed by Adhikaram some time back. There are differences between the present Buddhavamsa and its commentary to the extent that the commentary seems to have been written on some other text. There is a large number of stanzas in the Buddhavamsa whose existence was unknown to the author of the commentary, while the commentary contains a huge number of stanzas not found in the present Buddhavamsa. These differences are so great that we may rightly infer that the text which the commentator had before him was different from the one we have today, and that the original text received in Ceylon many additional verses after the Pali commentary was written. The Jatakanadana quotes 2 chapters from the Buddhavamsa. They are identical not with the relevant chapters of the present Buddhavamsa, but with the commentarial versions. It also shows that the present Buddhavamsa is quite different from the Buddhavamsa, which is referred to in the Pali commentaries. The Buddha Pakinikakanda and the Ditubhajaniya, the last 2 chapters of the Buddhavamsa, are not commented on in the Buddhavamsa Athikatha. A statement found at the end of the commentary indicates that the first of these 2 was known to the commentator. However, the statement further shows that the chapter known to the commentator had only 18 stanzas. Since there are 20 stanzas in the present Buddha Pakinikakanda, it can be easily concluded that last 2 stanzas were added to it later. The commentator had no knowledge whatsoever of the Ditubhajaniya, the last chapter of the present Buddhavamsa. This shows its non-existence in the pre-commentarial era. It should be remembered here that the Ditubhajaniya consists of stanzas identical with the stanzas that were added to the Mahaparinibbana Sutta by the Sri Lankan monks. The Vinaya Pitaka hardly underwent any change in Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan Buddhists were assiduous to maintain the Dhammasangani, Vibhanga, Dittukatha, Puglapanati, Yamaka, and Patena as they were brought to Sri Lanka by the Arahant Mahinda. There is no concrete evidence of Sri Lankan interpolations even in the Kathavathu. However, the inference that the Kathavathu underwent editorial changes in Sri Lanka cannot be ruled out when the problems pertaining to the Kathavathu at times in history are closely scrutinized. It is reported that Kathavathu is a collection of 1,000 discourses taken 500 from Sakavada and Parveda each. It is, however, counted that the number of points discussed and discarded in the text is 217. This gives an indication of 2 different versions of the Kathavathu. Athasalini, the commentary on the Dhammasangani, categorically states on 3 occasions that the Kathavathu is equivalent to the Daya in size. Nonetheless, the present Kathavathu and the Daya are not identical in size. The Daya is in fact larger than the Kathavathu. According to the commentary, the Daya has 64 Banavaras, while the Kathavathu is a text of 35 Banavaras in the light of a statement given at the end of the text itself. Accordingly, the Kathavathu is only about half the size of the Daya. A Kathavathu version equivalent to the size of the Daya is not available at present. A statement of extreme significance found in the Athasalini observes that there were various versions of the Kathavathu. It reiterates that the Daya and the Kathavathu are identical in size when what was rehearsed in the Third Council, not what is written now in books, is considered. Firstly, this statement indicates the multiplicity of the Kathavathu versions. Secondly, it indicates that some versions of the Kathavathu were more comprehensive than the others. The criteria suggested by the commentary to identify the original Kathavathu were its size and the nature of its contents. The original size, according to the commentator, was that of the Daya, while the contents contained 1,000 discourses. The word idani, now, found in the statement, idani padhek likitam agahet vasanjishropidinaya, emphasizes that the criteria suggested in the commentary dealt with a situation prevalent in Sri Lanka when the Athasalini was compiled. How far the extent to which this Sri Lankan effort to identify the original Kathavatthu had been successful cannot be now decided. If the present Kathavatthu was selected as the original one on the above criteria, what should be mentioned here is that it does not conform them. According to the foregoing analysis, it is quite obvious that there had been a noteworthy Sri Lankan contribution, not only to preserve, but also to foster the Pali Canon. After the Venerable Mahinda's arrival, Sri Lanka became the center of the Theravāda school of Buddhism. The Sri Lankan teachers perpetuated the Pali Canon by word of mouth for 3 centuries. Sri Lanka undertook the responsibility of preserving it even after the writing down. The translation of the Pali commentaries to Sinhala first, and the subsequent Pali translation of the Sinhala commentaries after 8 centuries were also carried out in Sri Lanka under the supervision of the Theras at Mahavihara in Anuradhapura. In these circumstances, it was quite natural that the Pali Tripitaka underwent certain changes and additions as an integral part of the activities carried out by the Sri Lankan teachers to preserve it. It is not surprising that a religious literature undergoes certain changes in the course of its history. What is surprising is that the Pali Canon, which is so extensive in size and subject matter, has been preserved as it exists today without much dilution and contamination. The credit of this should definitely go to Sri Lanka.